Someone in the comments of the last video compared the Tau's rate of technological advancement to Moore's Law. 64 people liked that comment. That is the highest engagement lore observation in the entire thread, and it connects to a question that nobody has run all the way to the end. Every major faction in Warhammer 40,000 is approaching its ceiling right now. Not in sequence, not in isolation, simultaneously. The Tau are building faster than physics should allow. The Necrons have woken up with a plan that requires the entire galaxy to still contain life. Hive Fleet Leviathan is currently sending 3 separate tendrils toward Terra. The Orks are fighting harder than they have in 10 millennia. Chaos already cracked the galaxy in half. When these ceilings crack at once, the question isn't who wins. It's what order everything falls apart in and whether that order changes anything. Every faction's win condition makes another faction's win condition impossible. That is the actual endgame of 40,000. Not a victor, a cascade. Gordon Moore, co-founder of Intel, first articulated his prediction in the 1960s and revised it formally at the 1975 IEEE International Electron Devices meeting. His law, transistor density on integrated circuits, doubles approximately every 2 years, yielding proportional performance gains. For 4 decades, that held. The semiconductor industry built modern civilization on that curve. Then it stopped. Around 2005 to 2007, what engineers call Dennard scaling ended. Moore's law technically continued in component counts, but proportional performance gains stopped tracking. By 2016, MIT professor Charles Liserson noted that Intel had taken 5 full years to move from 14 nanometer to 10 nanometer nodes, a transition that should have taken 2. The doublings were no longer yielding the dividends. The reason is physical. Silicon atoms are approximately 0.2 nanometers in diameter. At 2 to 3 nanometers, transistors are so small that quantum tunneling becomes unavoidable. Electrons jump through barriers they aren't supposed to cross, corrupting the switching accuracy that the entire architecture depends on. You can't manufacture transistors smaller than an atom. The ceiling isn't a business problem, it's a physics problem. The Tau hit an analogous wall, not in silicon, but in the fundamental question of how fast any non-psychic civilization can cross interstellar distances. Their first sphere of expansion ran from 502 M37 to 956 M38, roughly 1,000 years. In that time, the Tau went from a single world to 8 settled systems. Their FTL at this point was primitive to the point of being barely functional, operating near subluminally, which meant crossing even short stellar distances was an exercise in patience measured in generations. The Codex describes this period as a time of great scientific and cultural evolution, during which the Tau first advance into space, colonizing planets. Extraordinary by any historical standard. Glacial by what came after. Between the first and second spheres, the Tau made their Moore's Law moment. Reverse engineering a derelict alien vessel containing warp drive technology, the Earthcast built what became the ZFR Horizon Accelerator engine. For the first time, the Tau had practical faster-than-light travel. Fast relative to before, yes, but measured against what the Imperium runs on, the ZFR achieved roughly 20% the speed of a true warp drive. A significant leap, the gap remained enormous. The fourth sphere pushed further. Working from studies of captured Imperial warp drive technology and Kroot war spheres, the Earthcast developed the AL-38 slipstream module. What had taken months could now be crossed in days. The expansion that followed proved the improvement was real. The fourth sphere fleet pushed deep into previously unreachable space at a pace that had no precedent in Tau history. Then, the fourth sphere nearly killed them. The new drives were experimental. Several detonated catastrophically, tearing open what became the Startide Nexus, a wormhole that stranded most of the fleet in the warp. The survivors who emerged were traumatized in ways that permanently changed Tau understanding of themselves. Their claim to near-zero warp presence turned out to be incomplete. Something in the warp had come to the aid of the survivors, something that appeared to embody the greater good philosophy, evidence that the Tau's collective belief had generated a presence in the Imperium, however small. The sixth sphere, currently running post-Cicatrix Maledictum, uses the Great Rift as operational cover while expanding west into destabilized Imperial space. By every measure, the Tau are advancing faster than at any point in 6,000 years of expansion. And this is where the community analogy becomes genuinely useful for what it reveals about the ceiling. Tau FTL operates by accelerating ships over light speed in real space, skimming the boundary between normal space and the warp rather than plunging through it. This is precisely why their FTL is safer. The warp does not want them the same way it wants a human psyker. The Tau have a complete lack of psychic ability in the conventional sense, which means warp exposure that would kill an unprotected human fleet is merely dangerous to them rather than guaranteed extinction. But there is a ceiling baked into the method. Real space FTL can't be made arbitrarily fast. The physics of skimming the warp boundary have hard limits that no iteration of the slipstream module can engineer past. To cross the galaxy at competitive speed, the Tau would need to go through the warp, not around it, and they have no navigators. They have no Geller fields in the conventional form. The core architectural constraint remains. The community Moore's Law analogy captures exactly this. The Tau's rate of advancement is extraordinary, but the gains are approaching a boundary they can't iterate past without a fundamental architectural shift. The first sphere took 1,000 years to produce 8 worlds. The sixth sphere is expanding in decades. The doublings have been happening. But what happens when the doublings can no longer yield proportional dividends, and the only remaining gain requires entering the dimension that has already tried to consume their fleet once? That is the Tau ceiling, and it arrives at the same time as everyone else's. Someone in the same comment thread put the next part in different terms. The Necrons watching the Tau develop technology this fast, they said, was giving strong Palpatine energy. That comment hit 19 engagement, second in the thread. What makes the observation land isn't the specific fiction of a Necron watching a terminal. It's the underlying structural logic, which holds up under scrutiny even if no codex documents Necrons specifically monitoring Tau research programs. The Necrons are 60 million years old. They predate every faction currently active. The Eldar's Golden Age, the Imperium, the old ones who built the Orks as bioweapons. Sarek, the Silent King, was the last ruler of the Triarch, the 3 ruling dynasties of the Necron tier, and he personally negotiated the deal with the Catan star gods that traded his species' biological existence for immortal metal bodies. What the Necron tier gained in immortality, they lost entirely. Souls, sensation, the capacity for biological reproduction, the ability to feel anything at all. Sarek carries that decision across 60 million years. He ordered every Necron into a deep sleep in tomb worlds seated across the galaxy, then exiled himself into the intergalactic void rather than rest with them. In that void, he encountered something that clarified his entire endgame: the Tyranids. The canon on his motivation is unambiguous. Sarek understands that if the Hive fleets consume the galaxy, they will deprive his race of the host biomass required to reverse the biotransference process. His multi-million-year goal, reclaiming organic bodies for the Necron race, requires a galaxy that still contains life. Abundant life. The Tyranids aren't merely an enemy of the Necrons. They represent a direct threat to the one outcome Sarek has been working toward since before human civilization ignited. Official GW material on his return is direct. The Silent King comes back with one goal: to reclaim the galaxy in the name of the Necrons. Everything else is subordinate to that goal, and that goal can't be achieved without biomass. This is what the Palpatine meme gets right. even without a specific canon text describing Necron interest in Tau laboratories. The Necrons are ancient enough to perceive the arc of civilizations rather than just their current moment. A species advancing at the Tau's documented pace would read differently to a 60-million-year-old intelligence than it does to a 10,000-year-old Imperium scrambling to hold its borders. Whether or not a cryptech is assigned to monitor Tau research, and no codex documents this, the structural dynamic is sound. The canon confirms cross-faction alliances against Tyranids directly. Necrons and Blood Angels have cooperated against the Great Devourer in documented campaigns. Necron Gauss weapons destroy Tyranid biomass at a molecular level. A Tyranid killed by Necron technology can't be recycled by the Hive Fleet. For the Hive mind, every engagement with Necrons is a permanent net loss, not just of the battle, but of the biomass investment the organism represented. This makes the Necrons uniquely effective against the one faction that most directly threatens Sarek's endgame, which is why, as 3 new Leviathan tendrils push toward Terra in current lore, the Silent King's return to galactic politics isn't coincidental. The Necron endgame and the Tyranid endgame are mutually exclusive by definition. Only one completes. The question is which reaches peak first, and what the other factions are doing while that race runs. One commenter built the original cascading theory in 4 sentences, unprompted. Tyranids invade in greater numbers. Orks grow stronger from the harder fighting. That clash gives the Tau time to advance. The commotion wakes more Necrons. 22 people liked that comment. The lore supports the structure even where the specific mechanics need stress testing. Start with what the Tyranids actually are at this moment in current canon. 3 primary Hive fleets have made contact with the Imperium. Hive Fleet Behemoth arrived first in 745 M41, attacking head-on across the eastern fringe and breaking apart at Macragge. Hive Fleet Kraken arrived in 992 M41, different in structure, splitting into multiple simultaneous tendrils across thousands of light-years, which multiplied the shadow in the warp's psychic reach roughly tenfold compared to Behemoth's single wave. Hive Fleet Leviathan came in 997 M41, approaching from below the galactic plane, a vector no one had predicted, and is currently described as the largest Tyranid incursion in recorded history. Leviathan survived the devastation of Baal. Inquisitor Lord Kryptman had earlier tried to slow it by engineering a collision with the Ork Empire of Octarius, deliberately infecting those star systems with captured Genestealer broods to draw the fleet into a grinding war. Both races became thoroughly involved in destroying each other. The plan bought time. It also produced a side effect that the Warhammer 40,000 fandom wiki notes with notable concern. Tyranid organisms in the conflict began incorporating orkoid genetic material, producing assault creatures larger than anything previously cataloged. In 10th edition current lore, 3 new tendrils, Hive Fleet Nautilon, Hive Fleet Promothor, and Hive Fleet Grendulus, are moving in parallel toward Terra. The Imperium does not have the forces to stop them on every front simultaneously. The Hive Mind's goal is total galactic biomass consumption. It does not hold territory, seek resources in any conventional sense, or acknowledge the concept of surrender. Every world it processes is dissolved into fuel and new organisms. The Tyranid fandom page describes each Hive fleet stripping a planet of every scrap of biomatter in a matter of weeks without slowing the fleet's overall advance. Whole planetary ecosystems, billions of years of biological development, gone in the time it takes a human army to read orders and march. Here is where the cascade runs its first branch. The shadow in the warp is the Tyranid psychic phenomenon that envelops entire star systems ahead of the fleet. Lexicanum's direct entry on the mechanism states it disrupts the warp in a radius of several light-years and carries the added benefit of keeping the denizens of the warp in the warp. Psychers inside the shadow hear a billion alien commands scratching through their minds simultaneously. Astropaths can't send or receive messages. Navigators lose their sight of warp currents. Worlds under the shadow are isolated before the first organism even makes planetfall. For the Imperium, this means losing the ability to coordinate any meaningful response to the threat itself. For Chaos, this means demonic projection is suppressed wherever the shadow reaches. The warp activity that Chaos depends on for foothold in real space becomes structurally difficult to sustain. A full-scale Leviathan push toward the galactic core therefore disrupts the two most warp-dependent factions at the same time. The Imperium loses navigation. Chaos loses demonic presence in shadow regions. Both are fighting blind while the hive mind eats. The Tau, whose FTL does not use warp navigation, face no corresponding disruption. Their drives function in shadow territory. Their drones keep flying. Inquisitor Kryptman's deliberate creation of the Octarius War was, in part, a gift to the Eastern Fringe that neither party acknowledged as such. The Ork debate is where the script has to be honest, because the community is genuinely divided and the canon supports both positions. Position A. The Orks have already achieved their endgame. The Warhammer 40,000 codex language is direct. The Orks are the pinnacle of creation, for whom the great struggle is won. They have evolved a civilization with no internal contradiction, no unfulfilled goal. An Ork exists to fight. The galaxy is full of enemies. The galaxy has been full of enemies for 10,000 years of continuous recorded conflict, and it will remain full of enemies for the foreseeable future. By the Orks' own internal logic, they are in a permanent state of peak satisfaction. Ghazghkull Thraka, the self-proclaimed prophet of the Waaagh, captured the philosophy in a line reportedly spoken to his most persistent enemy, Sebastian Yarrick, after one of their battles. "A great fight, my best enemy." Spoken in High Gothic. An Ork who has fought long enough and won enough grows large enough and intelligent enough to learn the enemy's language, and what he says with its gratitude that the fight was worthy. The Waaagh isn't a means to an end, it's the end itself. The Waaagh field scales with the number of Orks and the intensity of their momentum. All Orks generate low-level psychic energy, creating a collective field that the Adeptus Mechanicus's own analysts believe enables their technology to function in ways that pure physics can't explain. Ork-built weapons frequently fail to work when removed from the presence of Orks entirely, which suggests the field has genuine physical effect rather than being pure metaphor. The larger the gathering and the harder the fighting, the stronger the field, and the more improbable things the field allows. An Ork army heading toward the greatest available enemies is, by this mechanism, building towards something that resembles exponential growth. A Tyranid invasion at scale would provide exactly what this requires: enemies that are endless in number, that grow more dangerous as the hive mind adapts, and that can't be reasoned with or stalled diplomatically. Pure combat at maximum scale, indefinitely. Position B. Fighting and winning aren't the same thing. The War of the Beast stands as the canonical counter-argument. In 544 M32, the largest Ork invasion in recorded Imperial history, led by the war boss known only as the Beast, came close to taking Terra itself. The Beast commanded attack moons that could phase between real space and what Imperial analysts called subspace. Multiple Primorks, Beast-level entities, existed simultaneously on different fronts. The Gestalt effect had grown strong enough that Orks under the Beast's direct influence were, in accounts of the campaign, bigger, smarter, and reportedly spoke perfect High Gothic. This wasn't simply a large Waaagh. It was a different order of phenomenon. The Imperium defeated it, not through attrition alone. The final mechanism was a reverse Waaagh weapon, captured Ork psychers working alongside the Sisters of Silence, generating a psychic counterpulse through the collective Ork field that caused chain reaction damage. The beast was killed directly. Primarch Vulcan engaged him personally. Ulanor was bombarded. After the defeat, the Waaagh fragmented into competing warbands. That fragmentation is the point the skeptics press. The Waaagh field isn't an automatic force that grows forever as long as fighting happens somewhere. It's organized around a dominant leader, the Ork whose perceived size and power makes him bigger than every challenger. Remove that organizing principle, and the field loses coherence. Individual warbands begin fighting each other rather than external enemies. The great unified force dissolves. Canon documents killing the war boss as an explicit strategy for breaking a Waaagh. It isn't guaranteed, not easy, and requires resources most factions can't easily commit, but it works. The field is psychically real, momentum-dependent, and fragile at its organizing apex. So the genuine open question is this. When Tyranids hit Ork space at full scale, does the Waaagh grow from the intensity of conflict, or does the hive mind's biomass recycling eventually consume more Orkoid matter and psychic potential than the fighting replenishes? Canon does not settle this. There is no codex statement that Orks grow stronger specifically from losing. There is equally no hard ceiling on Waaagh growth when momentum is sustained and the war boss remains dominant. That question lives in the comments. Present both sides, lay out the mechanisms, and let the audience argue about which dynamic dominates when the two endgames actually collide. The original comment thread had 16 likes on the Orks already won position and 0 likes but 4 active argument chains on the skeptic response. That asymmetry tells you the debate is alive and that no one has found a clean answer yet. Chaos benefits from everything. Every death, across every front, every act of war, every fear and rage and despair, feeding back through the psychic substrate of the galaxy. The warp amplifies it all, and the 4 Chaos Gods grow stronger. The problem is that the 4 Chaos Gods can't cooperate, by nature and by metaphysical design. Khorne and Slaanesh are polar opposites. Pure martial violence without pleasure versus pleasure without principle or limit. Tzeentch embodies change. Nurgle embodies stagnation. These aren't political differences that negotiation could bridge. Each god's existence is partly a negation of an opposing one, and the rivalry runs at the level of what each god fundamentally is. When the Cicatrix Maledictum tore open, a warp rift running from the Eye of Terror in the galactic west to the Hadex anomaly on the eastern fringe, the Chaos Gods had a genuine window. GW's own material on the event is direct. Had the Chaos Gods worked in unison in the wake of that terrible event, real space would doubtless have been utterly consumed by the sprawling madness of the warp. They didn't, because they are structurally incapable of it. Each perceived the catastrophe as an opportunity to advance their specific agenda rather than a collective victory to share. A chaos victory in the fullest sense would require real space to become indistinguishable from the warp, a complete dimensional merger. Community analysis of the lore points to an inherent contradiction in this outcome. Chaos feeds on the emotions of mortal creatures. Destroying everything destroys the power source. Total chaos victory is therefore catastrophic to chaos's own continuity. This means the 4 Chaos Gods are structurally incentivized to sustain the war indefinitely rather than resolve it, which positions chaos in the cascade as the entity that benefits passively from every other faction's escalation, and the entity least likely to end anything, because ending things is against its interests. The one counterforce to chaos escalation is the shadow in the warp. Wherever a Tyranid fleet is operating at scale, the psychic noise of the hive mind drowns out the emotional resonance the Chaos Gods feed on. Demon manifestation becomes harder in shadow regions. The warp quiets locally, even as the broader war it causes strengthens chaos everywhere else. A large enough Tyranid advance, therefore paradoxically, suppresses chaos activity in the regions it consumes, while simultaneously providing the galactic-scale conflict that raises the chaos power floor across the entire galaxy. Chaos is the noise floor of the cascade. Everything that happens raises it. The cascade doesn't give chaos a moment of decisive victory. It gives chaos a permanently rising baseline. One commenter asked, with what read as genuine curiosity, is there even a sliver of a chance that the Imperium and the Eldar could cooperate to kill Slaanesh? That question generated the highest reply ratio in the entire comment sample. More argument per initial comment than anything else in the thread. It's the question that makes people want to talk. The canon that makes it difficult starts with the fall of the Eldari. Slaanesh was born from the catastrophic collapse of their ancient civilization, the accumulated excess and depravity of millennia condensing into a singular psychic birth in the warp. Every Eldari who dies since then is immediately consumed by Slaanesh, soul taken, unless they carry a spirit stone to preserve themselves in an infinity circuit, or belong to the Ynnari with their specific protections. This isn't historical tragedy. It's the Eldari's ongoing existential condition, every death a loss that can't be recovered. Their endgame is Ennead, the Eldari god of the dead, gestating in the accumulated soul energy stored in craftworld infinity circuits across the galaxy. The canonical belief documented in Lexicanum, held by some Eldari seers, is that once every single Eldar has died, Ennead will awaken with sufficient power to defeat Slaanesh forever. Two things make this belief complicated. First, some seers is Lexicanum's own qualifier. This isn't universal Eldari doctrine. Second, the Ynnari faction, led by Yvraine, represent a direct challenge to the extinction requirement version of the prophecy. Yvraine died in arena combat and emerged infused with Ennead's energies. The Ynnari pursue awakening through accumulated death across a broader range of sources, rather than waiting for complete Eldari extinction. Two incompatible theories of the endgame, running simultaneously within the same people. If Ennead does awaken and kill Slaanesh, the consequences extend well beyond Eldari liberation. One of the four Chaos Gods is removed from the warp. The balance that has persisted for 10,000 years shifts with unpredictable consequences for the remaining three. Every Eldari soul that Slaanesh had accumulated would be freed simultaneously. A massive psychic event with no precedent to model it against. Could the Imperium help make this happen? Imperial doctrine says no. All Xenos are enemies of humanity, institutional policy at every level. But doctrine and operational reality diverge constantly. The Gathering Storm events produced documented Imperium-Ynnari cooperation that contributed directly to Guilliman's resurrection. Guilliman himself is noted as more pragmatic about alien alliance than virtually any other Imperial authority. He is also aware, after 10 millennia of absence and a subsequent crash course in what the Imperium has become, that ideology alone does not win wars. The structural barrier isn't only doctrine, it's knowledge. Most Imperial commanders don't understand the Eldari soul theft problem well enough to understand why killing Slaanesh benefits humanity. The long-chain benefit is real. Remove one Chaos God, destabilize the remaining three. Free psychic resources currently locked in an eternal war. But it requires a level of cross-faction strategic reasoning that the Imperium's institutional xenophobia actively suppresses. The honest canon answer? Possible in isolated instances, precedented in at least one major event, institutionally improbable, and practically unlikely to reach the scale the Eldari endgame actually requires. Whether any of that changes when every other endgame is also approaching its ceiling simultaneously is the question the cascade forces into the open. Commissar Conrad, at the launch of the Indomitus Crusade, described the mission simply: "We will cross the scar of chaos and reunite humanity step by bloody step." The Indomitus Crusade launched from Terra at approximately 999 M41. Its scale was extraordinary. Ultima Founding Primaris Space Marine Chapters, the Unnumbered Suns, Astra Militarum Regiments, Adeptus Custodes, Sisters of Silence, Elements of Battlefleet Solar, Rebute Guilliman in command. Its stated purpose: stabilize the Imperium after the Cicatrix Maledictum split the galaxy and cut half of human space from the light of the Astronomicon. The Crusade's first phase ran approximately 12 years and ended at the Battle of Raukos, after which Guilliman returned to Ultramar to fight the Plague Wars against Mortarion. Current edition lore classifies the Crusade as ongoing, with the canonical notation acknowledging that temporal distortions make all post-Rift dates unreliable. Inquisitorial Vox Thief logs from the Muster period record Guilliman in private conversation. I know that to save them would have been to lose the Imperium entire, and yet I hear their voices still. I always will, carrying them with me like some ghastly reliquary until the day I meet my end. This isn't a man winning a war. This is a man managing a collapse at a rate he hopes outpaces the acceleration of every threat converging on him simultaneously. The fundamental problem is the Golden Throne. The Emperor has been sustained on the throne for over 10,000 years. His survival requires a constant supply of psychers sacrificed to maintain optimal power to the ancient mechanism. Original estimates placed this at approximately 1,000 per day, with current community-compiled figures suggesting the demands have increased substantially as the throne degrades. The Adeptus Mechanicus can't repair the throne. The knowledge required was lost before the heresy, and the mechanism is failing incrementally, with no viable solution in sight. If the Emperor dies, the Astronomicon goes dark. Warp navigation for the Imperium becomes effectively impossible across vast distances. An uncontrolled psychic event of potentially galaxy-scale magnitude follows, as 10,000 years of contained psychic energy releases simultaneously. The Imperium's fleet, its armies, its communications, its identity as a galactic entity, all of it depends on a dying man on a broken machine. The Imperium's endgame isn't winning, it's surviving long enough for something else to change the equation. Guilliman is buying time. The question the cascade asks is whether the time he buys is enough, and whether the something else that might change the equation arrives before the throne does. Two different commenters in the thread asked where the Leagues of Votann were. Both named them specifically, and they deserve a direct answer. The Kin, the Leagues of Votann, are a civilization built around ancient AI cores called the Votann. Each League's Votann is a computational intelligence running since the dark age of technology, storing the Kin's entire accumulated history and providing the technological and cultural foundation the civilization depends on. The Kin are resource extraction specialists, operating in the galactic core and frontier regions, harder and more self-sufficient than most species in the setting, and deliberately independent of both the Imperium and every other major faction. Their ceiling is the Votann themselves. The cores are degrading, not catastrophically and not quickly, but accruing errors and developing what the Kin themselves acknowledge as something between mechanical wear and cognitive drift. Each Votann becoming slightly less reliable over time in ways that compound without any clear remedy. Nothing from the Dark Age can be rebuilt from scratch. The Kin use what survived, and what survived is wearing out. How the Votann degradation interacts with a period of maximum galactic stress, every faction in crisis mode, frontier regions destabilized, operational context shifting faster than at any point in post-heresy history, is genuinely underexplored in current canon. Their endgame ceiling is quieter than the others, but it's real and it's running. 4 different comments in the thread, totaling around 25 combined engagement, ask some version of whether factions could cooperate. The precedents exist and they matter. The Necrons have allied with Blood Angels against Tyranids at named campaigns. Inquisitor Cryptman engineered an Ork Tyranid war as a deliberate Imperium strategy. The Gathering Storm documented Eldar Imperium operational cooperation at the highest narrative level. The game's own alliance compatibility tables acknowledge that under extreme circumstances, factions that are normally enemies will fight alongside each other. The Imperium and Eldar as allies of convenience. The Imperium and Tau as desperate allies under sufficiently catastrophic conditions. The structural barriers are significant and documented. Imperial doctrine forbids Xenos cooperation institutionally, even while individual commanders override it regularly in the field. The Tau's greater good is explicitly expansionist. Other races joining the Tau Empire is annexation with better political branding. The Necrons view all living races as, in Zarok's framing, cattle to meet the needs of the Necron tier. They cooperate tactically when their interests converge, which is different from alliance. Bell of Lost Souls noted accurately, the Necrons and the Imperium want the Orks contained, the Tyranids driven away, and chaos suppressed. Those goals overlap significantly. Whether they can act on that overlap without immediately turning on each other after the common threat is neutralized is the question that has driven 40K's most interesting small-scale narrative moments without ever resolving at the galactic level. What the cascade changes is the cost-benefit calculation. Parallel interest, pointed at the same catastrophic threat, is historically the mechanism that produces every cross-faction arrangement this setting has ever documented. When every faction's endgame is also the threat to every other faction's endgame, the incentive structure for cooperation changes. Whether the doctrinal and cultural barriers can change fast enough to matter is a different question. So here is the board as it actually sits. Hive Fleet Leviathan's new tendrils, Nautilon, Promethor, Grandilis, push toward Terra while the Imperium fights on a dozen other fronts. The shadow in the warp falls across their advance path. Wherever the shadow falls, Imperial warp navigation fails, astropathic communication cuts out, demonic projection from chaos is suppressed locally. Isolated worlds fight alone. The Astronomicon becomes unreachable for those systems. Ork forces, energized by intensifying conflict, push harder. The Octarius War already demonstrated the dynamic in miniature. Sustained Ork-Tyranid combat produces Orks that grow larger and Tyranids that incorporate Orkoid genetics. Neither side becomes weaker from the fighting. Both sides become more dangerous. This loop does not stabilize on its own. The Tau, unaffected by the shadow, continue their expansion in the eastern fringe. Their drives work in shadow territory. Their drones keep operating. The chaos that degrades every other faction's operational tempo does not degrade theirs. The original commenter had this right. A Tyranid-Ork conflict at scale gives the Tau exactly the breathing room their rate of advancement has historically required. Zarek reads the biomass consumption rate and moves. Tomb worlds activate across the galaxy. Necron null zones, blackstone pylons driven through planetary cores, attuned to cut entire systems off from the warp, appear at strategic points. These weapons are devastating to the Tyranid advance. They also happen to be devastating to the Imperium's Psyker infrastructure, which requires the warp to function. The Silent King's anti-Tyranid strategy and his broader galactic domination strategy produce identical actions, which makes determining his actual priority at any given moment impossible. The Chaos Gods benefit from every death in every conflict. More war means more warp energy, means more demonic pressure at every thin point in the veil. The Great Rift remains open. The Cicatrix Maledictum cuts the Imperium in half and keeps it cut. Chaos's win condition advances as a passive consequence of everyone else's escalation, constrained only by the Four Gods' inability to cooperate and by the shadow in the warp suppressing their activity in Tyranid-heavy regions. The Eldari watch Leviathan's advance toward the galactic inhabited core and understand what it means for Iniad. Every craft world consumed is Eldari souls lost to Slanesh, rather than stored in infinity circuits. Every circuit destroyed is accumulated death energy gone. Their endgame has a deadline that just became shorter. The Inari's seventh path, accumulating death energy without requiring species extinction, becomes more urgent and more difficult simultaneously. The Imperium holds the center of this web and absorbs pressure from every direction. It's the faction most reliant on the warp for basic function, the faction with the most catastrophic single-point failure, and the faction that every other endgame scenario touches at some stage. If the Golden Throne fails while all of this is running, the cascade does not continue. It ends. Here is the paradox at the core of the cascade. The Necron endgame requires living biomass. The Tyranid endgame destroys it. The Eldari endgame requires killing a chaos god, which destabilizes the warp in ways that affect everyone's navigation and psychic infrastructure. The Ork endgame requires ongoing war at maximum scale, which also fuels chaos and sustains the pressure that keeps the Tyranids advancing. The Imperium's survival requires the warp to be functional and the Emperor to keep breathing, and both of those conditions are under attack simultaneously from multiple directions. Every faction's ceiling cracking does not produce a winner. It produces a galaxy where every win condition is simultaneously in play, and each one actively prevents the others from resolving. The ordering problem is what makes this simulation genuinely open. If the Necrons stabilize first, if Sarek's null zones establish enough of a defensive ring before Leviathan reaches critical mass, the biomass loss slows, the Tyranid advance blunts, and the remaining factions fight in a galaxy that still contains the conditions for their respective endgames. But Necron stabilization requires trusting that the Silent King's plan concludes with galactic protection rather than galactic dominance, which is a significant trust to extend to an entity who views all other living races as cattle. If Leviathan reaches the galactic core first, Shadow in the warp covering enormous regions, Astronomicon unreachable, chaos suppressed but the Imperium unable to navigate, the cascade resolves in the direction of the void. Not a Tyranid victory in the traditional sense, just consumption and the slow elimination of every other endgame's preconditions. If the Orks produce a great Waaagh of genuine, beast-level scale before the shadow falls across their region, comparable to the 544.M32 invasion that nearly reached Terra, the Tyranid advance slows through sheer combat pressure, the Tau's eastern expansion continues undisturbed, and the question of whether a beast-level Ork event can be broken again, with the reverse Waaagh weapon requiring resources the Imperium may not have available, becomes the critical decision point. Every ordering produces a different galaxy. That does not include what happens when the Votann cores begin producing significant errors during a period of maximum operational stress, or what the Inari path to Ennead looks like when infinity circuits are being destroyed faster than they can accumulate soul energy. One question sits at the center of this that the lore leaves genuinely open. If you could choose which faction's ceiling cracks first, which endgame begins its final run before the others, which choice produces the best outcome for the galaxy as a whole? The Necron stabilization scenario is mathematically appealing, but requires trusting Zarek's centuries-deep political agenda to produce a galaxy that still has room for other species' futures. The Eldari Ennead scenario removes one chaos god permanently and frees trillions of souls, but produces warp consequences no one alive has the models to predict. The Tau advancement scenario looks most benign, but runs directly into the physics ceiling that no iteration of their current technology can solve. There are probably 767 theories in the comment section of the original video. The cascade this video builds is one version of the chain. Drop the ordering that makes most sense to you in the comments below. And if you have a case for why the Orks have already won, or a case for why the skeptics are right and a broken Waaagh is just a broken Waaagh, make it. That debate has been running in this community since before the Great Rift opened, and the canon hasn't settled it. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of analysis. New lore dives every week.